The evening sky had turned a deep purple as Mr. Williams finished packing up his teaching materials after another successful parent-teacher conference. He smiled, thinking about how his students were progressing in his history class. Being a teacher for the past 12 years had given him a deep sense of purpose, watching young minds grow and develop critical thinking skills. The school hallways were quiet now, his footsteps echoing as he walked toward the parking lot. He'd stayed later than usual, taking extra time with parents who wanted to discuss their children's progress. That's just who he was, always willing to go the extra mile for his students. Driving home, he thought about tomorrow's lesson plan on the civil rights movement. He loved teaching this unit because it showed students how ordinary people could create extraordinary change. The street lights cast long shadows across his clean, well-maintained sedan as he carefully observed all traffic rules, a habit he developed over the years. Then came the flash of red and blue lights in his rearview mirror. Mr. Williams immediately did everything by the book, just as his father had taught him years ago. He turned on his interior lights, kept his hands visible on the steering wheel at 10 and 2, and pulled over to a well-lit area near a convenience store. His heart rate picked up, but he remained calm, drawing on years of experience in handling difficult situations as an educator. Through his side mirror, he watched the police officer approach. Something felt different about this stop. The officer's hand was already resting on his weapon, his stance aggressive rather than professional. Mr. Williams took a deep breath, reminding himself to stay composed, just as he advised his students when facing challenging situations. License and registration. The officer barked before even reaching the window fully. His nameplate read, Officer Peterson, and his tone carried an edge that made Mr. Williams's skin prickle with unease. "Good evening, officer," Mr. Williams replied in his calm teacher's voice, the same one he used to diffuse tense situations in his classroom. "May I reach for my wallet? It's in my back pocket." The officer's response came sharp and hostile. "Just hurry up, and don't make any sudden movements." As Mr. Williams carefully retrieved his documents, he noticed how the officer kept one hand on his weapon, despite his clear compliance and professional demeanor. The beam from the officer's flashlight swept aggressively across the car's interior, lingering on the stack of graded papers on the passenger seat and the school ID badge hanging from his rearview mirror. "Sir, may I ask why I was pulled over?" Mr. Williams inquired politely, maintaining eye contact through the side mirror while keeping his hands visible. His question was met with silence, then a dismissive scoff. "You were swerving," Officer Peterson claimed, though both men knew this wasn't true. Mr. Williams had been driving with extra care, as he always did. The situation grew more tense as passing cars slowed down to observe the scene. Through his mirror, Mr. Williams noticed Mrs. Chen, a parent he just met with at the conference, driving by. She slowed her car, clearly recognizing him. He saw her reach for her phone, and somehow, this small action gave him strength. "Officer, I respectfully disagree with that assessment," Mr. Williams stated calmly, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "I have been driving carefully and following all traffic laws. Would you please provide your badge number?" This simple, legal request seemed to flip a switch. Officer Peterson's demeanor shifted from hostile to openly aggressive. "Step out of the vehicle," he ordered, his hand now fully gripping his weapon. In that moment, Mr. Williams felt the weight of every similar incident he'd ever discussed in his history classes. He thought about his students, about the lessons he taught them about standing up for what's right while staying safe. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about everything he believed in and taught. Mrs. Chen had pulled over across the street, her phone now clearly recording the interaction. Other cars were beginning to slow down too, creating an audience of witnesses. The convenience store security cameras were also capturing everything, their presence offering a small measure of protection. The night air felt electric with tension as Mr. Williams prepared to face what would become a turning point not just in his life, but in his community's history. He had no way of knowing then that this moment would spark a movement for change, one that would transform his town's approach to law enforcement and community relations forever. Following Officer Peterson's command, Mr. Williams slowly opened his car door, his movements deliberate and careful. The cool night air hit his face as he stepped out, his teaching ID badge swaying gently against his pressed shirt. He could feel his heart pounding, but kept his voice steady, drawing on years of classroom experience in staying calm during tense situations. "Sir, I'm a high school teacher returning from parent conferences," he explained, keeping his hands visible at chest level. "I've done nothing wrong, and I'd like to understand why I'm being asked to exit my vehicle." The officer's response came through clenched teeth. "I don't care if you're the president. When I give an order, you follow it." His hand remained firmly on his weapon, despite Mr. Williams's obvious cooperation. More cars were slowing down now. Mrs. Chen had been joined by other parents from the school conference, their phones recording the escalating situation. The convenience store clerk had stepped outside, watching with concern. Mr. Williams could see his own reflection in the store window, a man in professional attire being treated like a threat for no apparent reason. "Officer Peterson," Mr. Williams said, reading the nameplate again, "I am following your orders, but I also have the right to know why I'm being detained. Could you please explain the reason for this stop?" His voice carried the same patient tone he used when helping struggling students understand difficult concepts. The officer circled him like a predator, flashlight beam dancing across Mr. Williams's face. "You think you're smart, don't you? Using big words, acting all proper. I've seen your type before." Those words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Mr. Williams thought about his students who faced similar prejudices, the discussions they'd had in class about standing up to injustice while staying safe. He straightened his back, dignified in the face of intimidation. "I'm simply asking for professional courtesy, officer. If you could provide your badge number and the reason for this stop, we can handle this situation appropriately." His words were measured, each one chosen carefully. The growing crowd of onlookers made Officer Peterson increasingly agitated. He grabbed his radio, calling for backup while keeping his other hand near his weapon. "Subject is being uncooperative," he barked into the radio, though anyone watching could see this was far from true. Mr. Williams remained still, aware that every moment was being recorded. The convenience store's security cameras hummed quietly above, their red lights blinking like silent witnesses. More community members had gathered, many recognizing their children's beloved history teacher. One of the parents watching called out, "We're here, Mr. Williams. We see what's happening." The support gave him strength, though he knew this moment was bigger than just him. It was about every lesson he taught about civil rights, about standing up with dignity in the face of injustice. The sound of approaching sirens filled the air. Officer Peterson's backup was arriving, but so too were local news vans, alerted by concerned citizens. The story was already spreading through social media, shared by parents and students who knew Mr. Williams's character. Through it all, Mr. Williams maintained his composure, though inside his mind raced with thoughts of his family, his students, and the impact this moment could have on them all. He thought about tomorrow's history lesson, how this experience would bring a new depth to his teachings about civil rights and peaceful resistance. As more police cars pulled up, their lights painting the scene in alternating red and blue, Mr. Williams stood his ground. He wasn't just a teacher anymore. He had become a living example of the principles he taught in his classroom. The night had transformed from a routine drive home into a moment that would spark important conversations about police conduct and community trust. The crowd of witnesses continued to grow, their presence both a comfort and a reminder of the responsibility Mr. Williams carried. This wasn't just about one traffic stop anymore. It was about setting an example for his students, showing them that standing up for your rights could be done with dignity and courage. By sunrise the next morning, the video of Mr. Williams's traffic stop had spread like wildfire through social media. Students arriving at school were already talking about what they'd seen online, the respected history teacher standing calm and dignified while facing unfair treatment. The school hallways buzzed with concerned conversations. "Did you see what happened to Mr. Williams?" Students whispered between classes. Many of them had watched the videos their parents shared, showing their teacher's peaceful strength in a difficult moment. During first period, the principal called a special assembly. The gymnasium filled with students, teachers, and staff, all united in their concern and support. When Mr. Williams walked in, the room erupted in applause. He hadn't planned to come to school that day, but he knew his students needed to see him, to know he was okay. "I stand before you today," he began, his voice carrying across the quiet gym, "not just as your teacher, but as someone who lived through what we've been learning about in class." He paused, looking at the sea of young faces. "Last night, I experienced firsthand why we study history, to understand that change starts with everyday people choosing to stand up for what's right." The local news crews gathered outside the school, but the principal kept them at bay, protecting the school community's privacy. Inside, students shared their own stories. A sophomore raised his hand during Mr. Williams's class. "My dad got pulled over last month," he said, voice shaking. "He told me to always keep my hands where they can see them. I was scared, but you showed us how to be brave." By lunchtime, community leaders had started calling the school. The local civil rights organization reached out, offering legal support. Parents flooded the school board with emails demanding action. The police department's social media pages filled with comments from concerned citizens sharing the video. The afternoon brought more surprises. Other teachers began incorporating discussions about civil rights and community relations into their lessons. The art teacher helped students make posters supporting positive change. The English teacher guided them in writing letters to local officials. Mr. Williams watched it all unfold with mixed emotions. He hadn't asked to become a symbol, but he understood the importance of this moment. During his planning period, he received a visit from a former student who now worked as a police officer in a neighboring town. "What happened to you isn't right," the young officer said. "Some of us are trying to change things from the inside. Your story is helping us push for better training and accountability." After school, a spontaneous gathering formed in the parking lot. Students, parents, and teachers stood together, holding handmade signs calling for change. They weren't angry or violent. They were inspired. Mr. Williams had shown them how to stand up for justice with dignity. Local church leaders and community organizers began planning a town hall meeting. They wanted Mr. Williams to speak, to help bridge the gap between law enforcement and the community. His phone kept buzzing with messages of support from former students, fellow educators, and even strangers who had been moved by his example. As the day drew to a close, Mr. Williams sat at his desk, looking at the pictures of civil rights leaders on his classroom walls. He thought about how they too had faced their moments of truth with courage and dignity. A student had left a note on his desk. "Thank you for teaching us not just history, but how to make history." The community's response showed him that one person's stand for justice could ripple out in unexpected ways. Parents were talking to their children about rights and responsibilities. Students were asking thoughtful questions about law and justice. Even some local police officers had reached out privately, expressing support for positive change. That evening, as Mr. Williams packed up his teaching materials, he felt a deep sense of responsibility. Tomorrow would bring new challenges: meetings with lawyers, interviews with internal affairs, decisions about how to push for meaningful change. But looking at the supportive messages flooding his phone, he knew he wasn't standing alone. The community had come together, turning a moment of injustice into a movement for positive change. The police department's internal affairs investigation began with a meeting in a cold gray room. Mr. Williams sat across from two investigators, his lawyer by his side. The video playing on the screen showed every moment of that night from multiple angles: the dashcam footage, bystander videos, and the convenience store security tape. "Let's go through this step by step," the lead investigator said, his tone more respectful than Mr. Williams had expected. They watched as Officer Peterson's aggressive behavior played out on screen. The investigator paused the video several times, taking detailed notes about the officer's conduct and violations of department policy. What happened next surprised everyone. Other officers started coming forward, sharing their own concerns about Officer Peterson's past behavior. A young officer spoke quietly about witnessing similar incidents, but feeling powerless to speak up. Another shared documentation of complaints that had somehow disappeared from official records. The investigation expanded beyond that one night. Records were pulled, witnesses were interviewed, and a pattern emerged. The department's filing cabinets held other complaints against Officer Peterson, some dating back years. Many had been filed by minority drivers, but they'd been buried under paperwork or dismissed without proper review. Meanwhile, the police chief faced mounting pressure from the community. Local news stations camped outside the police station, waiting for updates. The mayor's office was flooded with calls demanding accountability. Even officers' families were asking questions at dinner tables across town about what really happened behind the badge. Mr. Williams received an unexpected visit at school from a senior police officer who'd been on the force for 30 years. "I've been quiet too long," the officer admitted, sharing documents that showed how bias had seeped into department training over the years. "Your case made me realize we need to clean house." The internal affairs team discovered troubling details in Officer Peterson's personnel file. Previous supervisors had noted concerns about his behavior, but had never taken serious action. Training sessions that should have addressed bias had been skipped or marked complete without actual attendance. During one intense meeting, the police chief watched all the footage again, this time with community leaders present. The room fell silent as they observed Mr. Williams's calm dignity contrasted with Officer Peterson's unnecessary aggression. "This isn't what we stand for," the chief finally said, his voice heavy with realization. The investigation revealed more than just one officer's misconduct. It exposed systemic problems that had been ignored for years. Missing complaint forms, skipped bias training sessions, and a culture of silence had created an environment where such behavior could flourish. Support for change came from unexpected places. Retired officers sent letters backing the investigation. Police officers' spouses started speaking up at city council meetings, saying they wanted their loved ones to serve in a department the community could trust. Even some of Officer Peterson's former partners admitted they'd seen warning signs, but hadn't known how to address them. The internal affairs team worked late into many nights, piecing together years of incidents. They found that traffic stop data showed concerning patterns in how certain officers, including Peterson, treated minority drivers. The evidence was clear and undeniable. As the investigation continued, the department began making immediate changes. Body camera policies were strengthened. Complaint procedures were simplified and made more transparent. Training requirements were tightened, with real consequences for non-compliance. Mr. Williams received regular updates, each one confirming that his stand had sparked necessary change. The investigation wasn't just about one traffic stop anymore. It had become a complete review of how the department operated, trained its officers, and served its community. One investigator pulled Mr. Williams aside after a particularly long meeting. "You know," he said quietly, "sometimes it takes one person willing to stand up to show us where we've gone wrong. Your case is changing how we do things, and it needed to happen." The investigation was thorough, methodical, and sometimes painful for the department. But with each passing day, it became clearer that this process, though difficult, was necessary for healing the relationship between the police and the community they served. Behind closed doors, away from the public spotlight, Mr. Williams faced his own private battles. Night after night, he found himself replaying the traffic stop in his mind. Even the softest police siren in the distance would make his heart race. His wife noticed how he checked his rearview mirror more often now, how his hands gripped the steering wheel a little tighter. Teaching remained his anchor. In his classroom, surrounded by eager young minds, He found purpose in turning his experience into valuable lessons. But some days were harder than others. During a lesson about civil rights pioneers, his voice caught unexpectedly as he realized he now understood their courage in a deeply personal way. "Are you okay, Mr. Williams?" a student asked one morning, noticing the dark circles under his eyes. He'd been up most of the night preparing for another meeting with lawyers and community leaders. He managed a warm smile, touched by their concern. "I'm learning to be," he answered honestly. His wife, also a teacher, became his strongest support. She'd watch him pace the kitchen late at night, working on speeches for community meetings. "You're not just fighting for yourself," she'd remind him, brewing another cup of tea. "You're fighting for every student who's ever sat in your classroom." The weight of being a symbol for change was heavy. News outlets wanted interviews. Civil rights organizations asked him to speak at events. Everyone wanted to hear his story, but few asked about the toll it was taking. Some nights, he'd sit in his home office, looking at old photos of himself teaching, wondering if he'd ever feel that carefree again. His fellow teachers noticed changes too. The history teacher, who always had a ready smile, now sometimes seemed lost in thought during lunch breaks. But they rallied around him, covering his classes when he needed to attend legal meetings, leaving encouraging notes in his mailbox. One morning, he arrived at school to find his students had decorated his classroom door with paper hands, each one containing a message of support. "You taught us that change isn't easy," one note read, "but it's worth fighting for." Reading their words, he felt tears well up in his eyes. The stress began showing in small ways. He'd forget simple things, like where he placed his coffee mug or what time a meeting was scheduled. His doctor noticed his blood pressure had risen and suggested counseling. At first, he resisted. He was supposed to be strong, wasn't he? But his wife gently insisted, reminding him that true strength includes knowing when to seek help. In counseling, he learned to process his emotions healthily. The therapist helped him understand that his feelings were normal responses to an abnormal situation. They worked on techniques to manage anxiety and cope with the pressure of being thrust into the public eye. His students became unexpected sources of healing. They shared their own stories of facing discrimination, creating a space where vulnerability became strength. One day, a quiet student stayed after class. "My dad says you're teaching us more now than ever," she said. "You're showing us what courage really looks like." The school principal noticed Mr. Williams saying late most evenings, grading papers or preparing lessons, as if trying to prove he was still the same dedicated teacher. "You don't have to carry this alone," she told him, arranging for some administrative support to lighten his load. During a particularly tough week, his wife organized a surprise dinner with close friends and colleagues. They shared stories, laughter, and reminded him that he wasn't just the face of a movement. He was still himself, still loved for who he always been. That night, he slept better than he had in weeks. Slowly, he learned to balance his new role as an advocate with his need for personal peace. He started taking short walks during lunch breaks, finding quiet moments between meetings to breathe deeply and center himself. His wife suggested they start a garden together, giving him a peaceful project to focus on outside of the ongoing legal battles. The personal cost was real, but so was the growth. Each challenge made him more determined to create lasting change, not just for himself, but for every student who'd ever looked to him for guidance. In his moments of doubt, he'd remember the words of the civil rights leaders he taught about, how they too had faced their fears and emerged stronger. The courthouse steps were crowded the morning Mr. Williams filed his formal complaint. News cameras clicked and whirred as he walked up with his legal team, his wife's hand steady in his. The lawyers had spent weeks preparing, gathering evidence that went far beyond that single traffic stop. Inside the courthouse, the atmosphere was tense but purposeful. Mr. Williams's lead attorney, a civil rights veteran with kind eyes and a determined spirit, spread documents across the conference room table. "This isn't just about one night," she explained. "We're challenging the whole system that let it happen." The legal documents told a powerful story. Page after page detailed similar incidents that had been swept under the rug. Former victims of Officer Peterson's misconduct began coming forward, their statements adding weight to the case. Some had been afraid to speak up before, but Mr. Williams's courage gave them strength. During the initial hearing, Mr. Williams sat quietly as his attorney presented their case. The judge, a serious woman with reading glasses perched on her nose, listened intently as they outlined the pattern of discriminatory behavior. The police department's lawyers shifted uncomfortably in their seats as evidence mounted. "Your Honor," Mr. Williams's attorney said, "this case isn't about punishment. It's about making sure no other citizen faces what my client experienced." She presented their demands, not just compensation, but real policy changes, better training, and true accountability. Back at school, students followed the case closely. They started a civil rights law club, inviting local attorneys to speak about citizens' rights and responsibilities. Mr. Williams watched proudly as his students applied their history lessons to current events, understanding how the past connected to their present. The lawsuit uncovered troubling patterns in police department records. Years of complaint forms had been filed away without investigation. Training sessions on bias and community relations had been marked complete without any real participation. The evidence painted a picture of systemic problems that needed fixing. One afternoon, during a break in legal proceedings, an older police officer approached Mr. Williams in the courthouse hallway. "I've been on the force 30 years, he said quietly. "What happened to you? It's been happening too long. Some of us want change too." The case began attracting attention from police departments in other cities. They sent observers to the hearings, taking notes on what not to do, learning from another department's mistakes. Reform advocates cited Mr. Williams's case in their push for better police training nationwide. As the legal battle continued, more community members got involved. Local church groups held prayer vigils for justice. Business owners put up signs supporting police reform. Even some retired officers spoke out, saying the department needed to change with the times. Mr. Williams's wife noticed how he stayed up late reading legal documents, highlighting important sections, asking thoughtful questions. "You're not just fighting a legal battle," she told him one night. "You're teaching the biggest lesson of your career." The courthouse became a second home as weeks turned into months. Mr. Williams learned legal terms he never thought he'd need to know. His attorney explained each step carefully, making sure he understood his rights and options. They weren't just building a case, they were building a foundation for change. During one crucial hearing, Mr. Williams took the stand. He spoke clearly and calmly about that night, about his years of teaching young people to believe in justice, about his hope for real change. The courtroom fell silent, absorbed by his words. Even the defense lawyers seemed moved. Support came from unexpected places. A group of police officers' spouses wrote a public letter backing the call for reform, saying better training and accountability would protect everyone, including their loved ones on the force. Their support showed this wasn't about being anti-police. It was about making policing better. The lawsuit slowly began reshaping department policies. Even before the final ruling, changes started happening. New training programs were developed. Complaint procedures were simplified. Body camera rules were strengthened. Mr. Williams' stand was already creating ripples of positive change throughout the system. The City Hall meeting room buzzed with energy as Mr. Williams stood at the podium, addressing the newly formed Police Reform Committee. What started as his personal struggle had grown into a community-wide movement for change. Looking around the room, he saw faces from all parts of town. Concerned citizens, police officers, community leaders, all united in wanting something better. "We're not here to point fingers," he began, his teacher's voice carrying clearly through the room. "We're here to build bridges." The reform initiative he helped create wasn't about blame. It was about making real, lasting improvements in how police and citizens interact. Working alongside progressive police officers turned out to be eye-opening. A younger officer shared his own frustrations with outdated training methods. "We spend hours learning how to handle our weapons," he explained during one planning session, "but barely any time learning how to handle our biases." The committee meetings often ran late into the evening. They reviewed body camera footage from different departments, studied successful reform programs from other cities, and drafted new training guidelines. Mr. Williams's experience in the classroom proved valuable. He knew how to break down complex ideas into teachable moments. One breakthrough came when they started involving local teenagers in the discussions. Students from Mr. Williams's school asked tough questions about police interactions, and officers listened. These conversations weren't always easy, but they were necessary. Both sides began to see each other as people, not just uniforms or statistics. The new training program they developed was different from anything the department had tried before. Instead of dry lectures, they created interactive scenarios. Officers practiced de-escalation techniques with community volunteers. They learned about the history of policing and civil rights from local historians, including Mr. Williams. During one session, an older officer stood up with tears in his eyes. "I've been doing this job for 20 years, he said, "and I'm just now learning things I should have known from day one." His honesty encouraged others to share their own revelations and concerns. The Civilian Oversight Committee took shape, with members representing different parts of the community. They set up a clear system for handling complaints, making sure every voice would be heard. Mr. Williams helped design a process that was fair to both citizens and officers. Technology played a big role in the reforms. The committee worked on updating body camera policies, making sure footage couldn't disappear or be tampered with. They created a public database where citizens could track the status of their complaints. Everything was designed to build trust through transparency. Local businesses got involved too. A tech company donated software for tracking police interactions. Restaurant owners offered their spaces for community police meetings. Even the local coffee shop started hosting monthly coffee with a cop sessions, where officers and citizens could talk informally. The changes weren't just on paper, they were visible on the streets. Officers began spending more time walking their beats, getting to know the people they served. They visited schools not to show authority, but to build relationships. Kids who used to run from police cars now waved hello to officers they knew by name. Mr. Williams watched as his students became part of the change. They volunteered to role-play in training scenarios, helping officers understand how young people view police interactions. Their input helped shape policies that would affect their own futures. During one community feedback session, a mother stood up with her young son. "Last week, a police officer stopped to play basketball with my boy," she said. "A year ago, I would have called him inside. Now, I took pictures. That's what change looks like." The reform initiative wasn't just changing policies, it was changing hearts and minds. Officers who initially resisted the new training began to embrace it. Community members who once distrusted all police started seeing the human beings behind the badges. It was slow progress, but it was real. Throughout it all, Mr. Williams kept teaching, both in his classroom and in police training sessions. He showed how history's lessons could guide present-day solutions. His experience had taught him that real change happens when people stop seeing each other as enemies and start working together as neighbors. The morning the final decision came down felt different from the start. Sunlight streamed through the courthouse windows as Mr. Williams and his wife walked hand in hand through the security checkpoint. The usual crowd of reporters waited outside, but today their cameras seemed less intrusive. Inside the courtroom, you could hear a pin drop. The judge adjusted her glasses, looking at the papers before her with careful attention. Mr. Williams sat straight-backed beside his attorney, thinking about all the events that had led to this moment, from that night on the street to the months of testimony and evidence. After careful consideration of all evidence presented, the judge began, her voice clear and steady. "This court finds significant cause for action. She detailed how Officer Peterson's conduct that night violated multiple department policies and constitutional rights. But she didn't stop there. The judge's ruling went beyond just one officer's actions. She pointed out the department's failure to address previous complaints, the gaps in training, and the need for systemic change. This case, she said, has exposed issues that require more than just disciplinary action against one individual. When she announced Officer Peterson's termination, the courtroom remained quietly respectful. This wasn't about celebration. It was about justice and accountability. The judge then outlined the mandatory changes: body cameras for all officers, improved complaint procedures, regular bias training, and stronger oversight. Mr. Williams's wife squeezed his hand as the judge mentioned how the lawsuit's settlement would focus on department reform rather than just monetary compensation. This had been his main request, that any settlement money should go toward making real changes in police training and community programs. Outside the courthouse, Mr. Williams addressed the waiting reporters. "Today isn't about winning or losing," he said, his teacher's voice steady and clear. "It's about making sure our community becomes stronger, safer, and more united. This is just the beginning of the real work." Back at the police department, changes started immediately. Officers watched as their colleague cleaned out his desk, a sobering reminder that actions have consequences. The chief called an all-hands meeting, making it clear that the old ways of doing things were over. The local news showed clips of Officer Peterson's final exit from the police station. There was no anger or drama, just a quiet departure that marked the end of one era and the beginning of another. Some officers looked relieved, as if a weight had been lifted from their shoulders. At school the next day, Mr. Williams' students greeted him with a standing ovation. One student had brought in a newspaper with the headline, "Justice Served. Teachers Stand Leads to Police Reform." The class spent that period discussing how ordinary people can create extraordinary change. The city council met that evening to officially adopt the new policies. The mayor signed documents implementing mandatory body cameras, enhanced training requirements, and a civilian review board. Mr. Williams sat in the audience, watching democracy in action, seeing how his stand had led to real change. Community leaders approached Mr. Williams about starting a program to help other departments learn from their experience. "Your story could help prevent this from happening elsewhere," they said. He agreed, knowing that true change often starts with sharing knowledge. The police department's new training center was named the Community Bridge Academy, symbolizing its mission to connect law enforcement with the people they serve. Mr. Williams was invited to be a regular speaker, sharing his experience to help new officers understand the importance of treating every citizen with respect. That evening, walking through his quiet neighborhood, Mr. Williams noticed a police car on patrol. The officer waved, and for the first time in months, he waved back without feeling anxious. It was a small moment, but it represented something bigger, the beginning of healing, of trust being rebuilt. At home, his wife had framed the court decision alongside his teaching certificate. "Two different kinds of history making," she said with a smile. Looking at them side by side, Mr. Williams realized that sometimes the best teaching happens outside the classroom. 2 years had passed since that fateful traffic stop, and the school auditorium was packed for the annual Teaching Awards ceremony. Mr. Williams sat among his fellow educators, thinking about how much had changed. The student body president approached the microphone, holding an envelope with a special smile. "This year's Teacher Excellence Award goes to someone who taught us more than just history," she announced. "He showed us how to make history." The audience erupted in applause as Mr. Williams made his way to the stage, his students standing in respect. The award wasn't just for his classroom teaching. It recognized how he transformed a personal challenge into a community-wide lesson about justice, dignity, and positive change. His experience had become part of his teaching, bringing textbook concepts to life for his students. That same week, he received an invitation that touched him deeply. The State Police Academy wanted him to speak to their new recruits about community relations. His story had become a case study in police training programs across the country, showing how one incident could lead to meaningful reform. Walking into the police academy felt surreal. Young cadets filled the seats, their uniforms crisp and new. Mr. Williams shared his story, not with anger or bitterness, but with hope for a better future. Your badge gives you authority, he told them, but your actions earn you respect. The changes in town were visible everywhere. Police officers regularly visited schools, not for security, but to build relationships. They played basketball with kids in the park, attended community events, and knew residents by name. The us versus them mentality was slowly being replaced by a sense of shared community. His former students, now in college, often wrote to him. One became a law student, inspired by watching the legal process unfold. Another joined a police department in a different city, determined to be part of the change. Their choices showed how one person's stand could inspire others to make a difference. The Civilian Oversight Committee he helped establish became a model for other cities. Visitors came to study how police and community members worked together to solve problems. The complaint system was transparent, body cameras were always on, and trust was slowly being rebuilt. Mr. Williams's classroom walls now held new pictures alongside the historical ones. Photos of community police meetings, youth leadership programs, and successful reforms showed students that change wasn't just something that happened in history books. It was happening in their own time. One morning, he arrived at school to find a surprise. His students had created a timeline display in the hallway, connecting historical civil rights moments with present-day changes in their community. His traffic stop was there, not as a moment of injustice, but as a turning point toward progress. The local news did a follow-up story marking 2 years since the incident. They interviewed community members, police officers, and students about the changes they'd seen. The reporter asked Mr. Williams if he ever regretted taking a stand. "When you stand up for what's right," he replied, "regret isn't part of the equation." His wife noticed how he'd started smiling more, how the tension had eased from his shoulders. The garden they'd planted during the difficult days was now blooming, much like the seeds of change they'd helped plant in their community. During the last class of the year, a quiet student raised his hand. "Mr. Williams," he said, "you taught us that history isn't just about remembering the past. It's about creating a better future." The whole class nodded in agreement. As he packed up his classroom that afternoon, Mr. Williams paused to look out the window. A police car drove by slowly, and the officer waved to some kids playing nearby. The kids waved back without hesitation. This, he thought, was what real change looked like. Not just new policies on paper, but new trust in people's hearts. The story wasn't over. Real change never is. But standing there, watching his community heal and grow, Mr. Williams knew that sometimes the biggest chapters in history start with one person simply choosing to stand up for what's right.